I don't know what it's supposed to say, but we'll figure that out. I'll read from my Bible during the sermon. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. I just wanted to show you kind of a metaphor of how our life goes, you know? Nothing runs smoothly. It's good to be here. It's good to see you guys. It's good that we have Thanksgiving coming up this week. And I want to start with this cycle that we've been talking about of loving your neighbors, moving them to loving God. These are the two greatest commandments: to love the Lord with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Getting people to fall in love with God and then moving them to serving others. We have to be servants as Christians. We have to put our faith into action. Our theme this year is God first, and the theme verse is Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 7. You shall teach them, that is the commandments, diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. This quarter we're talking about God and others. How do we connect God with others? We've been talking about God and you. How do you connect with God? God in your family, connecting with God in your family, and teaching the commandments to your children. God and work, not just the workplace, but the way that we work as Christians. The Bible has a lot to say about putting our faith into action and working for the kingdom. And so this final quarter, we're talking about God and others. You may have seen this all over the news this past week. This is Megan Rapinoe, famous soccer player. She was in her final game of her final season before she retired, and she had a non-contact injury. She was literally just kind of softly running on the field, and she went down and claimed there's an issue, possibly a tear with her Achilles heel. And she was interviewed after the game, and she said this: "I'm not a religious person or anything, and if there was a God, this is proof that there isn't." She immediately and rightfully got a lot of heat, even from people who are not professed Christians. And they said, "This is absolute nonsense. You're a narcissist. Even if if you don't believe in God, fine. But to say that you had this non-contact injury as proof that there's no God, because somehow you're entitled to end your career without an injury during that last game, you're delusional." And I heard other critics say, well, this injury proves that there is a God, which I thought was a little bit humorous and obviously kind of just satire. But she received a lot of heat for that. And I want to talk about this, as we connect God with others, what we say about God and about each other and about our own life circumstances, it really matters because people are watching. Brent talks a lot about our attitude as Christians and how important that is. Because if we have a bad attitude towards God and towards each other as Christians, Christianity is a big turnoff to people. We already are facing many, many different crises, and I've been talking about this for a long time, not just within the churches of Christ, but this is happening all over the place. The Christian Chronicle just posted an article, I think it was yesterday, it was published, that Oklahoma Christian, one of our sister colleges, Oklahoma Christian in Oklahoma City just announced that they're closing their school of theology due to a lack of volume. They've had a declining number of students, and so the MDiv, which is what I have, I got my MDiv at Harding in Memphis, which also they made an announcement back in August that they're closing their Memphis campus, and they're moving that to Searcy because of declining numbers and budget issues. And so this was a huge deal when Harding made that announcement. Also less than a year ago, in December of last year, Lipscomb University announced that they're closing their Masters of Theology program in Austin, Texas. They had kind of a satellite campus, and they kept the one in Nashville open, but they closed the one in Austin because of lack of numbers. So this is a growing problem, and as Christians, we can't really afford to make it look like we're getting ripped off by God if somehow our lives are not all peachy all the time. We've been going through Revelation, and it's interesting because God is telling the churches, be prepared for persecution. In fact, as we talked about this morning, there's a good possibility that what Jesus meant to the one church is that you all are going to face persecution unto death, which means this congregation, this church, will no longer exist. That's a big deal. Does that mean Christianity is dying out, though? I don't think so, not by a long shot. Even with all these closures within the churches of Christ, you have colleges and graduate schools. We had, man, I'm really drawing a blank. See, I'm erasing words out of the biblical text because they're like eluding my mind. Was the Christian University in Vienna, West Virginia, Parkersburg. Help me out. Ohio Valley, yeah, OCU. So they closed down, not even 2 years ago? So we're having all of these closures. I mean, colleges, graduate schools, they're closing down. This is happening. This is happening in real time. And so when you get statements like this, well, I'm not really a religious person, or maybe people say, I used to be a religious person. We hear this a lot, right? I used to be really religious, but, all these bad things have been happening, so that just proves there is no God. I've heard people who were once Christians make that argument. And so today we're talking about that. In a world of suffering, there's plenty of suffering going on. Plenty of suffering. If you're there for the prayers at the beginning of Brent's class, you learned there's a lot of suffering going on right now. Tons of suffering. So what does the Bible have to say about that? I'm going to back up a little bit because our main text is in Acts chapter 14, but I want to back up to the conversion of Saul, which is found in Acts chapter 9. I didn't have it put up on the screen, but I want you to just kind of listen at what's going on. We all know the story. Paul's on his way. Paul, formerly Saul, is on his way to Damascus, and he's going to persecute the church, right? He's so angry at Christians, and he's calling them blasphemers, and they don't really know God. And so he's on his way to Damascus with a letter to persecute Christians. He has permission. He has authority. He can put them in jail, he can kill them, he can do whatever he wants. Paul has the authority to do it. And so he's on his way to Damascus. There, we have it pulled up there, Acts chapter 9. But Saul, still breathing out threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. I'm an ESV, by the way. I don't know if you want to switch versions, but I'm using ESV, English Standard Version. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, Who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do. The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice but seeing no one. Can you imagine that? I mean, imagine that for a second. This voice comes from heaven. You clearly hear it. You know what he's saying, and you're terrified. Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him to Damascus, and for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. Now there was a disciple at Damascus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, Ananias. And he said, Here I am, Lord. And the Lord said to him, Rise and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas look for a man of Tarsus named Saul, for behold, he is praying. And he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight. But Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he's done to your saints at Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priest to bind all who call on your name. But the Lord said to him, Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. And then the rest of that is Ananias baptizes Saul. And when he's baptized, these scales fall from his eyes, and then he can see clearly. Saul, also called Paul, becomes very faithful. We know he disappears for several years. He kind of falls off the face of the map. But then he comes back with a vengeance. He comes back in a good way. He comes back and begins preaching everywhere. And as Jesus said, he's preaching to kings. He's preaching to Israel. He's preaching to Gentiles. Paul preaches to mass amounts of people. And don't forget about the suffering. I will show him how much he will suffer for my name. And then back to our main text in chapter 14. This is on the very first missionary journey. So Paul goes up to the church in Antioch of Syria, which becomes the sending church. By the way, that church literally met in a cave. That cave still exists to this day. They dug into the side of the mountain in Antioch of Syria because of Paul. The church in Jerusalem was being persecuted, so the Christians moved north. They kind of spread all over, but a bunch of them moved north. They went to Antioch in Syria. They literally burrowed into the side of a mountain, and that's where they had their worship. That became the sending church, the church that we read about. They were called Christians first at Antioch. That's Antioch of Syria. Not only were they called Christians first there, but they become the mother church, the sending church for Paul on all of his missionary journeys. I think that's powerful. It shows what God can do and how God redeems. In chapter 14, on his first journey, he's kind of chased around and goes all over the place. And then he comes to a place called Lystra, where Timothy's from, and he's stoned and he's left for dead. And if you can imagine how badly those injuries were, that people literally thought he was dead, he was not moving. Likely, we've talked about this a lot before, he probably had broken bones, broken ribs, broken arms, possibly fractured legs. And this is what's fascinating. Starting in verse 19. But the Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples gathered about him, he rose up and entered the city, that is in Lystra, where he was stoned. He went into the city, and on the next day, he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. Derbe is over billy goat paths, up and down, switchbacks, very dangerous if you're at your healthiest. On the next day after he was left for dead with all his broken bones, and a lot of people think that his eyesight was bad from the stoning incident. He writes about that in the letter to Galatians. He says, "See, I write this with my own handwriting. See what big letters I use." Paul had very bad vision, likely from this incident when he was stoned and he was getting smashed in the eye socket with rocks. He was suffering. And can you imagine, unlike the soccer player who injured herself literally just walking and says, see, this is proof there is no God. If there was a God, then this proves that, he's not real. Unlike her, Paul is out preaching, being incredibly faithful to that call. He is doing everything by all measures, doing everything right as a Christian. He's preaching, he's teaching, he's healing people. He's being faithful to the very end. He's stoned, he's left for dead, and listen how he responds. Again, verse 20, but when the disciples gathered about him, he rose up and entered the city, and on the next day he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. When they had preached the gospel to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, the very place where he was stoned. They returned to Lystra and to Iconium. Iconium, by the way, is north of Lystra. That's where the Jews came down and incited the Jews in Lystra to the point that they stoned him. They hated Paul at Iconium. They returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch. That's not Antioch of Syria, that's Antioch of Pisidia, which, incidentally, is where John Mark abandoned them just a few months prior to this. That was the whole reason that Barnabas and Paul went separate ways, because on the second journey, Barnabas wanted to take John Mark, and Paul said, absolutely not. Don't you remember? He abandoned us on the first trip. That was at Antioch of Pisidia. Lots of heartache, lots of suffering, lots of bad things happened. And listen what Paul does. He's going into each of these cities that they had visited where all these bad things happened. Verse 22, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church with prayer and fasting, they, that is Paul, and his companions, with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. That's a good response. You want to talk about how you connect people with God? Be like this. Be an encourager. Be a comforter. Be somebody who takes people in the middle of their pain and confusion and all the persecution and all the chaos that was going on in this day. Be an encourager and be a comforter. Paul did that. And you know what happened? I don't think it was like this major success, this wild success at first. And I think a lot of people think that, look, we hear this a lot, right? We're restoration churches. Follow the blueprint of the New Testament church and what? God will bless it, and we'll be the church of Christ, this shining church on the hill, and everybody will look to us. What's happening right now? What did I just mention at the beginning of my sermon? What's happening within our colleges and universities? People are abandoning the universities and the churches to the point of closure. We've had, since I was in school, how many years ago? I mean, I began college in 1997. I graduated college in 2001. I remember then there was a major shortage of Bible majors. They were begging people to be Bible majors at Harding when I was there. There was a major shortage. It's far worse now. I mean, it's at like level 10 out of 10 crisis. When I went to graduate school in Memphis still, I graduated there in 2007. It was pretty established. Harding had been there since 1966 in Memphis on that campus. It was very well established, very well funded. That was in 2007 Fast forward to 2023, that's not that long ago. They closed it. I mean, it's done. That's a huge deal. And so I think we're disillusioned if we think that, Paul had it easy and we follow this blueprint that's in the Bible and all of a sudden God's going to bless the church and it's going to grow and it's going to go crazy. I don't think it works that way. I think at the end of the day what matters more than anything, what matters the most is our faithfulness to God. That through all the suffering and all the challenges and all the things that life throws our way, that we be faithful to God and we demonstrate that to people. We encourage people. We show people who Christ is and not expect anything in return. I think that's part of the problem, is that so many Christians expect this abundance, this good health and happiness and God's going to take care of my life and all these things are going to go great for me. And I believe God blesses us, absolutely. Hands down, period, I believe that. But do you believe God blessed Paul? I would say Paul was very blessed. But he struggled. He went through many, many sufferings for the name of Christ. And so we've got to teach people that life is going to throw all kinds of stuff our way. We're going to face all kinds of struggles, all kinds of troubles. It could be financial, it could be mental, it could be emotional, it could be spiritual. We're going to be thrown all kinds of things our way. It's how we handle that and demonstrate that to other people that matters. Our faithfulness to God is, in the end, that's what's going to connect people to God. We've got to show people like Paul did, that God is the first love in our life, that God matters. And Paul, by the way, never gave up. He did, like I mentioned, he preached to kings. When he was arrested and finally sent to Rome, he kind of boasted about all the freedom that he has. And he's like, I'm reaching more people now than I ever have in my life. And that was when Paul was imprisoned in Rome. And I don't think he was exaggerating. I don't think he was bragging. I think that God opens up possibilities for people to come to Christ, even under severe persecution and suffering, when we are faithful. So we might have universities closing their doors. We might have graduate programs that are closing or restructuring. That might be the case, but I don't think this is anywhere close to the end of the church, at least as a whole. I think there are so many people who are starving for some kind of answer right now, and they're starving for truth. So now is not the time for Christians to give up. Now is the time for us to say, look at all the opportunity that's around us. I want to encourage you with that message. Go out, find people to bless, and show them your faith. Don't be ashamed of your faith. Don't hide your faith. Don't think, they're going to think I'm nuts. They're going to think I'm crazy. Don't even think that way. Be faithful to God, and I promise you, God will connect people back to Him. God will do what God does. If there's anybody this morning who's not yet taken that step to put Christ on a baptism, or if you have prayer needs, we invite you to come up.